The wind slammed the rental car door before Ellen could close it herself. She stood in the gravel driveway, fingers tight around the handle of a single suitcase. Cape Cod smelled like wet leaves, salt, and something old that refused to leave. The little shingled house crouched against the gray sky, windows shining with cold light. Behind it, the sea roared like someone arguing in another room, constant and unyielding. She had promised herself a month of silence, a month away from familiar Boston streets. No colleagues, no neighbors asking how she was holding up after everything. Just her suitcase, and the ghost of a man who never came back to shore alive. Ellen swallowed hard, feeling the full weight of her 58 years settle inside her. 2 years a widow, and still every step forward felt like a small betrayal of his memory. The key trembled slightly in her hand as she turned it in the rusty lock. Inside, the house smelled of old wood, cold air, and forgotten coffee grounds. Dust floated in thin autumn light like gentle, harmless ghosts passing by. There was a couch, a small table, cheap framed pictures of anonymous boats on walls, and somewhere behind the walls, the sound of waves insisted with steady persistence. Ellen left her suitcase on the floor and walked straight to the front window. There it was, the Atlantic, gray and endless like a scar that never fully healed. Waves broke in nervous white lines across the cold stretch of sand below her. For 2 years she had avoided exactly this sight, as if it carried poison inside it. Now she stood facing it, her legs weak and her stomach tight with old memories. Just a month, she whispered, as though negotiating with the ocean itself. A month to remember, or a month to forget. She wasn't sure which one she feared most. Autumn had always been Mark's favorite season, filled with cold light and crisp air. He used to say the world looked like it was beginning again when the leaves fell. But now the leaves fell and the world felt worn, tired, and uneven in her hands. She turned on the old heater and listened to its exhausted mechanical rumble. She removed her coat but kept her scarf, as if still bracing against the outside cold. The quiet in the house felt too thick, like something alive pressing into her chest. No Mark adjusting the windows, no voice narrating the color of the sky outside. Just the echo of things unsaid on the day he left and never returned. In the kitchen, she found a cracked mug and a note from the property owner. "Enjoy the peace. October is the best month here," the rounded handwriting said. Ellen let out a short, dry laugh that caught on something tender inside her. Peace was not what she expected to find on this coastline marked by memory. The distant waves answered for her, reminding her nothing here was settled yet. Night arrived earlier than Ellen expected, falling like a heavy wool blanket. The windows turned black, reflecting her own pale and tired face back at her. The sea continued its restless roar outside, unsettled by the darkness around it. She tried to distract herself with a book, though the words slipped away quickly. Every sentence dissolved into memories she had spent years trying not to revisit. She made tea and watched the water begin to boil with a quiet, slow urgency. The kettle's whistle merged with the steady rhythm of the breaking waves. She remembered how Mark loved that sound, calling it a perfect evening duet. He used to say the sea spoke to anyone brave enough to listen closely. Ellen wondered if listening tonight was bravery or emotional recklessness. She sat on the couch with the warm mug resting between her cold hands. The book lay open on her lap, but she didn't manage to read a single line. The wall clock ticked relentlessly, pushing her closer to old memories. She listened to the waves, the way someone listens to a confession being made. There was a tightness in her chest, equal parts longing and guilt intertwined. A memory arrived uninvited, as memories often do at night's edge. The last phone call from Mark, his voice bright before the boat ride. "Back before sunset, I promise," he had said with familiar confidence. She remembered laughing and telling him not to joke about the time. Now every sunset felt like an unpaid debt she owed to a vanished moment. She walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside with slow care. Outside, only darkness, her reflection, and the steady call of the waves existed. It felt like the ocean was whispering her name in every line of foam. Her eyes burned, though she stubbornly fought the urge to cry. Crying felt like surrendering to a collapse she wasn't ready to face. Her body felt heavy with travel, but her mind refused to settle or quiet. She imagined driving back to Boston that very night, escaping the sea's pull. She pictured the long highway, headlights carving through empty dark roads. But nothing in Boston felt less painful than staying here by the ocean. The hurt was not in the place, it had taken root inside her instead. She curled up in the narrow bed of the small main bedroom. The mattress creaked with every small shift, complaining softly beneath her. The waves seemed to enter through the walls, filling the room with their sound. She closed her eyes, searching for silence in a mind that refused to rest, but all she found was the image of a boat that never returned to shore. The next morning arrived, washed clean, pale light stretching across the sky. Ellen put on her heavy coat, laced her worn shoes, and stepped outside to walk. She hoped exhaustion from the walk might calm the noise inside her chest. The air tasted like salt and damp leaves, sharp enough to wake her fully. The sea in front of her looked less angry today, though still impossibly vast. She followed the narrow trail from her house down to the shoreline. Every step made gravel crunch and thin branches cracked beneath her feet. Wind tugged at her unpinned gray hair, moving it across her face. Her hands stayed in her pockets, a small shield against the world. The horizon stretched out like a promise she no longer believed in. Then she saw movement near the low tide line, a small shape wandering. A beagle was sniffing the sand with deep concentration, nose close to the ground. His long ears flapped lightly as he moved, totally absorbed in some mystery. He looked up once he sensed her presence, his brown eyes alert and bright. For a moment, they simply stared at each other like surprised old friends. "Hey buddy," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. The beagle wagged his tail slowly and took a few cautious steps toward her. He seemed to weigh whether this wary woman could be trusted. Ellen looked around for an owner, someone calling out a missing dog. But there was no one, just the sea, the wind, and distant gulls crying. The dog sniffed the hem of her coat, curious and completely unafraid. She stepped back instinctively, unsure why the contact startled her so much. Animals reminded her of a gentleness she hadn't felt since Mark was alive. He used to pet every dog he passed, laughing with contagious warmth. Thinking of that made something sharp and fragile shift inside her chest. "You're lost, aren't you?" she murmured, knowing he couldn't answer. The beagle tilted his head as if considering the question seriously. Then he simply began walking beside her without asking permission. She tried to ignore him, keeping her eyes on the waves as she moved. But the soft sound of his paws made a rhythm she couldn't tune out. At the end of the walk, she stopped where the trail led back to her home. She turned to face the dog, who stared back with quiet expectation. "You need to go back where you came from," she said, pointing to the beach. He simply sat down and wagged his tail, disagreeing gently but firmly. Ellen sighed, feeling for the first time that morning a little less alone. The next morning, the beagle was still there, curled up near the porch. Ellen found him asleep, a small warm circle of fur on the wooden boards. His chest rose and fell in peaceful rhythm, oblivious to human worry. She watched him for a few seconds, something softening quietly inside her. Then she cleared her throat and pretended she hadn't been staring at all. The dog stretched, yawned widely, and trotted behind her with confidence. Ellen rolled her eyes, though a hint of reluctant affection flickered through. They walked the familiar path toward the shoreline together, mismatched companions. The sea greeted them with steady waves, comforting in their constancy. It felt like a strange ritual forming between them without discussion. Farther down the beach, an older man stood casting his line from the rocks. He wore a thick coat, a blue knit hat, and boots worn soft by decades of use. Deep wrinkles crossed his face like old maps carved by salt and sun. He raised one hand in greeting when he noticed her drawing near. "Morning," he said with the ease of someone expecting company. She hesitated before returning the polite wave, unsure why she felt shy. "Good morning," she answered, her voice steadier than the day before. The beagle ran to the man, sniffing eagerly at his boots and pant legs. The fisherman laughed softly as he scratched behind the dog's ears. "Looks like he's adopted you," he said, casting Ellen a knowing smile. "I don't think so," she replied, folding her arms across her chest. "I'm just renting the place up there for a short while." The fisherman nodded, as though that piece of information confirmed something. "Name's Walter," he said, jerking his chin toward the open water. "Been fishing off these rocks longer than I can remember now." Ellen introduced herself automatically, without offering much detail. She didn't explain the sadness in her eyes or the weight in her voice. Walter didn't ask, as though he sensed that stories take time to unfold. He watched the bobber drift on the surface, patient as the tide itself. "Sea's calmer today," he commented, referring to more than weather. She sat on a nearby rock, the Beagle settling contentedly between them. The silence stretched comfortably, not a threat, but a quiet space to breathe. She listened to the gentle pull of Walter's fishing line in the wind. For a few minutes, she felt neither judged nor required to be anything. When she finally rose to leave, something inside her felt whisper softened. The afternoon arrived with a different kind of light, bright and slanting low. Ellen walked beyond the usual stretch of shore, curious without admitting it. The Beagle followed, happy to explore new scents with boundless energy. Far ahead, a small blue cabin stood against the pale sand like an exclamation. Its bold color challenged the gray palette of sea and sky around it. As she drew closer, she noticed canvases propped along the cabin's wall. They showed the ocean in its endless moods, violent, quiet, silver, dark. Bold strokes, carved movement into each wave, fierce and full of feeling. The smell of paint mixed with salt air, forming a strange, vivid aroma. The Beagle sniffed each canvas as if evaluating them thoughtfully. A gray-haired woman with a messy knot rose from the cabin doorway. She wore a paint-stained apron in layered splashes of blue and green hues. Her gaze was direct but gentle, a curiosity without intrusion. "You must be the new renter in the gray house," she said warmly. Word travels quickly in a small place like this one. Ellen felt a mix of surprise and social uncertainty flood her chest. "Yes, I'm staying there for a little while," she answered cautiously. The woman wiped her hands on a cloth, stepping forward with ease. "I'm Margaret," she said, nodding like an artist greeting a muse. "I paint the sea when it decides to let me, not before, when it lets you," Ellen repeated, intrigued by the phrasing. Margaret pointed to a painting where dock waves rose like furious beasts. "Some days it only screams," she said. "Nothing to learn from that." Then she gestured to one painted bright with soft gold reflections. "And some days it whispers secrets, if we wait long enough to hear them." Ellen approached a smaller canvas where the sea seemed caught mid-breath. A golden streak broke through the horizon, barely there, yet unmistakable. She felt something tighten in her chest as she studied that fragile light. It looked like the visible shape of something inside her she couldn't name, something wounded, but not fully extinguished, still reaching upward. "Do you paint?" Margaret asked, with an honest, open curiosity. Ellen shook her head, a reluctant smile tugging at her lips briefly. "I used to like watching someone else paint," she said softly. She thought of Mark watching artists for hours with warm fascination. Walking away, she realized this place was stirring long-buried things. The sky darkened before noon, pulling a heavy curtain across the horizon. Ellen felt the pressure shift, the air tightening like an unseen hand. Wind swept sand in sharp bursts that stung her face and chilled her skin. The Beagle whimpered softly, ears pinned back as he sensed the change. She hurried up the path to the house just as thunder cracked the air open. Inside, the windows rattled while rain hammered the glass relentlessly. The lights flickered once before, stabilizing, humming with tension. Ellen wrapped herself in a blanket as the Beagle curled against her legs. Storms always awakened the memory of that night, sharp and intrusive. Every boom of thunder felt like an old wound being struck again. She tried to steady her hands by making tea, but they shook too much. The kettle hissed sharply, fighting for attention over the storm's roar. Her breath came shallow, matching the frantic rhythm of the falling rain. She closed her eyes, but the storm painted old scenes behind them. Mark's voice, the promise, the boat, the sky turning too dark, too fast. A tear fell before she realized it had reached the edge of her cheek. She brushed it away with frustration, angry at her own frailty. Grief arrived in unpredictable waves, always without warning. Tonight, it rose faster than she could gather herself to resist. The Beagle nudged her knee gently, grounding her to the present moment. She slid down to the floor, her back pressed against the worn couch. Thunder rolled again, shaking the house like an accusation long overdue. The sea outside pounded at the shore with relentless fury and weight. It sounded like a warning, or perhaps a confession she could not decipher. Her heartbeat trembled inside her ears, echoing the storm's unrest. The Beagle climbed into her lap, warm and impossibly trusting in her. His small weight steadied her, softening the storm inside by degrees. She stroked his fur slowly, matching her breath to his calm presence. The house creaked and groaned beneath the wind's heavy insistence. For the first time, she whispered the truth aloud. "I'm still afraid." The storm raged on for hours, refusing to loosen its grip on the night. When at last it broke, silence spread slowly across the darkened house. Ellen exhaled deeply, as though rising from deep water after too long. Something within her had cracked, yet something else had loosened. She did not feel healed, but she felt the smallest shift beginning. Morning arrived, pale and washed out, still shivering from the storm. The sky looked fragile, unsure of its own ability to brighten again. Ellen stepped outside, the damp sand sinking beneath her steady shoes. The Beagle trotted beside her with renewed energy and quiet joy. She felt tired, yet the exhaustion carried a strange, new clarity. She looked toward the old wooden pier standing far down the shore. It seemed closer today, as though the storm had drawn it toward her. She felt a knot twist inside her stomach at the thought of going there. Mark had loved that pier, claiming it was where he could hear the sea think. But something within her whispered insistently that she needed to go. Her feet began moving before her doubts could anchor her again. Each step pressed softly into the wet sand, leaving clear footprints. The pier grew larger with every slow, careful pace she took forward. The Beagle raced ahead happily, barking as if urging her onward. Ellen continued walking even as her legs trembled beneath her resolve. At the start of the pier, she froze, breath caught in her throat. The boards looked weathered yet sturdy, worn smooth by tides in time. A cold gust brushed her face, steady but not cruel in its presence. She placed one foot on the wood, waited, then placed the other. The pier creaked under her weight, acknowledging her tentative step. She walked slowly, gripping the railing with her stiff, chilled fingers. The ocean stretched beneath her deep, restless, nothing hidden now. Her throat tightened as memories rose like dark water inside her. Mark stood here once, golden in sunlight, unreachable in memory. She closed her eyes, letting the ache roll through without resistance. When she opened her eyes again, the sea was no less immense, but she was still standing, shaking, hurting, yet undeniably standing. The pier no longer felt like a graveyard of moments she had lost. It felt like a place where broken pieces might quietly breathe again. She whispered a fragile promise into the wind, "I'm trying." As she walked back, the wind softened and warmed her chilled skin. The Beagle ran delighted circles, kicking up flecks of damp sand. Ellen felt a faint warmth bloom slowly at the center of her chest. A step had been taken, and the earth had not opened beneath her feet. Something had shifted, though its meaning was not yet clear. Walter stood on the rocks again, casting his line with steady grace. The sea shifted in deep green tones, murmuring old, private secrets. The wind carried the smell of salt mixed with sun-dried seaweed. The Beagle sprinted toward him, tail wagging in unrestrained joy. Walter laughed in greeting, patting the dog with familiar affection. "Storm treating you all right?" he asked without turning fully. Ellen stepped closer, still carrying the weight of the long night. "It was loud," she said, choosing her words with care and honesty. Walter nodded as though he understood the layers beneath the reply. "The ocean reminds us we're smaller than we think, not weaker, smaller." She watched the bobber rise and fall with the gentle breath of the tide. The surface moved like a patient organism, alive and ever-shifting. "Did you ever lose someone?" she asked, surprised at her own voice. Walter closed his eyes briefly before answering with quiet certainty. "Not to the sea," he said, "but loss comes in waves all the same." He adjusted the line carefully, each movement thoughtful and slow. "I lost my wife 20 years ago. Heart failure, sudden, early morning." Ellen felt her own chest clench at the honesty in his steady tone. "People think grief fades," he added. "It never fades, it changes shape." Behind him, the sea echoed the sentiment with a measured sigh. She sat on a flat rock nearby, the Beagle settling contentedly beside her. "Sometimes I feel like living again is a betrayal," she confessed quietly. Walter smiled with gentle sadness, understanding without judgment. "Honoring someone isn't the same as imprisoning yourself," he said calmly. "Love doesn't ask us to stop living, it asks us to keep going forward." Ellen looked out at the horizon, letting his words sink deeper into her. The breeze carried a soft chill, but not an unwelcome or hostile one. She thought of the pier, the storm, and her trembling steps through both. She wondered if healing might be less impossible than she had believed. For the first time, she allowed that thought to remain without fear. When she finally rose to leave, the sea had calmed into a steady hush. Walter lifted a hand in a warm, simple gesture of farewell to her. The Beagle bounded across the sand to follow her footprints home. Ellen inhaled deeply, the air moving through her with less resistance. Something inside her was shifting up, fixed, but finally moving. The afternoon light shifted into soft gold, warm despite the cold air. Ellen felt drawn to Margaret's blue cabin without fully knowing why. The Beagle trotted beside her, sniffing at shells and seaweed happily. The cabin looked brighter than before, almost humming with color. Its canvases were now covered with heavy cloths to protect them. Margaret opened the door before Ellen had the chance to knock. "Good timing," she said, her smile relaxed yet perceptive. "I just finished a piece. I'm not sure I understand yet myself." She gestured for Ellen to come inside the paint-scented cabin. "The sea's been talking in strange ways since last night's storm." The studio was a chaos of deliberate color and layered emotion. Brushes stood crowded in jars, evidence of hours of restless work. A single new canvas sat on an easel, awash in afternoon light. Ellen approached slowly, feeling her pulse quicken in her throat. The painting pulled something in her chest, taut with recognition. Dark waves surged beneath a sky bruised with heavy shadows. Yet, along the horizon, a thin band of gold broke through gently. It was faint but insistent, a whisper of light refusing to leave. The contrast between darkness and hope felt startlingly alive. Ellen felt tears threaten, surprising her with their stubborn force. "It's beautiful," she murmured, voice catching in her tight throat. Margaret crossed her arms and tilted her head thoughtfully. "It feels heavy," she replied, "like something holding its breath." Ellen nodded, recognizing that same heaviness within herself. "Sometimes that's the most honest form of beauty," she whispered. Margaret rested a gentle hand on Ellen's shoulder with warmth. "Healing isn't about forgetting pain," she said with quiet clarity. "Sometimes it's about seeing it clearly for the very first time." Ellen closed her eyes briefly, letting those words settle deeply. They opened a space she had kept locked for far too long. The Beagle yawned loudly, sprawling at the door in comfortable trust. Margaret laughed softly, easing the heaviness in the room naturally. "That little guy knows when hearts shift," she said, amused and tender. Ellen stroked the dog's head, grounding herself in the moment. Leaving the cabin, she felt the world expand subtly around her. The next morning, Ellen decided she needed to do the responsible thing. The Beagle deserved to be reunited with whoever he belonged to before. She fashioned a makeshift collar from an old scarf she no longer wore. The dog accepted it without protest, tail wagging in patient trust. "Let's find your home," she said, though the words pinched her heart. The small town center was quiet, washed in early autumn sunlight. Short houses lined the street, windows decorated with shells and charms. She knocked on the first door, feeling oddly nervous for no reason. An elderly woman answered, but said she had never seen the dog. "Cute fellow, though," the woman added before closing her door gently. Ellen walked to a little market, where locals gathered for small talk. The shop owner studied the Beagle with a puzzled, thoughtful frown. "Never seen him," he said, shaking his head with certainty. "Dogs around here don't usually wander far from their homes." Ellen felt something twist faintly inside her at his certainty. She posted small flyers on the community board near the square. A photo, a phone number, and a short description filled each one. Each pinned flyer felt like an unexpected act of letting go inside her. The Beagle sat at her feet, watching her with calm, trusting eyes. She avoided his gaze, knowing it asked questions she feared answering. They continued walking through the narrow, quiet streets together. Children pointed at the dog and giggled, pleased by his friendliness. A cyclist stopped briefly to ask if she needed any help locating an owner. But no one recognized the gentle Beagle with the curious brown eyes. Hope of finding his home drifted away like smoke on a cool breeze. "Maybe you don't have a home," she whispered without thinking it through. The Beagle lifted his head, responding as though he understood her tone. He pressed his warm nose to her hand, soft and reassuring in gesture. Ellen felt a lump rise in her throat, surprising in its intensity. The thought of letting him go hurt more than she expected it would. They returned home as the sun began its slow descent behind the dunes. She removed the scarf collar gently, folding it with unexpected care. The Beagle curled beside the door as if choosing it with intention. Ellen realized she was postponing what felt obvious and terrifying. Sometimes a home isn't something found, it's something that chooses you. The morning unfolded in muted silver, soft and hesitant across the horizon. Ellen stood at the water's edge, her shoes sinking slightly into damp sand. The sea breathed in slow, steady waves that neither threatened nor welcomed. The Beagle sat behind her with quiet awareness, sensing the gravity within her. She felt the air shift around her, like an invitation she feared yet needed. Her heartbeat thumped in her ribcage, a slow but insistent rhythm of dread. She remembered every shoreline she had avoided for too long, haunted years. She thought of all the mornings she turned away from anything salt touched. But today, something deep inside refused to let fear issue its commands. The ocean's rolling voice pressed gently toward her, leaving no place to hide. She stepped forward until the foam brushed lightly against her shoes. Cold water rushed through the fabric, sharp enough to steal her breath. Her legs stiffened instinctively, but she forced herself not to retreat. Mark had always said the first touch of the ocean woke up the soul. "Wake up," he used to whisper, laughing as the waves chased his ankles. Ellen closed her eyes as memory collided with grief inside her chest. The storm, the mist sunset, the silence, everything rose like a tide. The guilt pressed heavy on her shoulders, relentless and unkind. But she steadied herself and let the emotions break over her freely. She no longer stepped away from the pain. She let it crest and fall. She walked deeper until water reached her shins, cold and consuming. Her breath shook, caught between terror and a strange kind of release. Waves surrounded her with indifferent power, vast yet honest in nature. Her legs trembled, refusing to lie about the fear moving through her. Tears blurred her vision, indistinguishable from the salt around her. "I'm still here," she whispered, voice cracking but steady enough to mean it. The words felt like a confession she had been avoiding for 2 long years. She wasn't apologizing to the sea, nor to Mark, nor to any lost moment. She was apologizing to herself for holding her life in suspension. A quiet warmth flickered inside her chest, fragile yet undeniably real. She remained there until the cold numbed her legs into soft clarity. When she turned back toward the shore, the Beagle barked anxiously. Ellen laughed, a sound raw and uneven but alive with relief. The waves had not swallowed her, nor had grief overtaken her entirely. For the first time, she felt forgiveness beginning to form inside her. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of seawater, mixed with fresh paint. Ellen walked toward the blue cabin with steps steadier than before. The Beagle trailed behind her, tired from running but content and loyal. Margaret stood outside painting, brush gliding with practiced ease. She looked up at Ellen with concern blooming gently in her eyes. "You look different," Margaret said, resting her brush with soft curiosity. Ellen exhaled, a small smile flickering at the edges of her expression. "I went into the water today," she said, the words simple but weighted. Margaret nodded slowly, as though that single sentence explained everything. "Ah," she murmured. "Then the sea finally decided to speak to you." They sat in 2 paint-stained chairs near the open cabin door. The wind lifted the corners of tarps, covering some unfinished canvases. The Beagle stretched out at Ellen's feet, warm and reassuringly present. "Tell me," Margaret said, her voice patient and free of expectations. Ellen closed her eyes briefly, letting the story shape itself inside her. "I thought the water would crush me," she began with trembling honesty. "I thought stepping into it meant I was leaving him behind forever." "Leaving him behind," Margaret repeated with gentle, steady emphasis. Ellen nodded, tears gathering but refusing to fall just yet. "Like living again meant betraying what we had and what I lost." Margaret looked toward the horizon before speaking, thoughtful and slow. "Loss tricks us into believing we must carry it like a punishment," she said. "But grief isn't a debt, and love isn't a set of chains around your life." Ellen let those words seep into the cracks inside her chest carefully. "Then why does it still feel like this weight is stitched into me?" Margaret's smile was sympathetic and deeply understanding. "Because you loved deeply, and deep love forever leaves its mark," she said. Her hand rested lightly on Ellen's, warm and grounding without demand. "But pain changes once we stop facing it in absolute loneliness." The silence that followed felt gentle, like a blanket instead of a burden. The Beagle lifted his head suddenly, sensing a shift in the air. Margaret laughed softly at his quiet intuition, breaking the moment. "That little dog knows exactly when something inside you moves," she said. Ellen stroked the Beagle's fur, feeling steadiness grow inside her breath. For the first time, she felt more alive than simply surviving the day. Dawn arrived with a restless wind and a whisper of coming change. Ellen walked along the rising tide, the sand cooled beneath her steps. The Beagle ran ahead, nose lifted as if reading the shifting air. The sea felt different today, attentive, neither calm nor violent. Waves rolled forward with purpose, carrying something back to shore. Then she saw it, a piece of wood emerging from the wreckaged foam. It was small, weather-worn, and shaped by years of drifting. She knelt slowly, a tremor moving through her before she touched it. Faded letters clung to one side, ghost-like but still recognizable. Her breath caught as she realized it belonged to Mark's boat. The world seemed to narrow around her as she held the fragment. The scent of salt deepened, pulling her fully into the moment. She pressed the wood to her chest, tears burning behind her eyes. Memories rose in a fierce wave-warmth, laughter, promises whispered, and the final image, a boat leaving the harbor, never returning. The Beagle approached quietly, nudging her gently for reassurance. Ellen inhaled sharply, fighting against the collapse building inside her. "Why now?" she whispered, voice cracking as though the sea might answer. Water surged around her feet, retreating again with a soft hiss. It felt as though the tide was returning something she needed to face. She carried the wood to a flat rock and sat down with care. The fragment rested in her lap, a piece of the past finally resurfaced. It wasn't a sign or apologies of something real that had once existed. It showed her the simple truth of an ending she never accepted fully. And somehow, seeing it freed a long-locked place inside her heart. "Mark," she whispered, the name rising like a small wave. Not in sorrow, but with a gentle gratitude she hadn't felt before. The sea responded with a soft wave that barely kissed the shore. The guilt she had carried for years loosened, fading like low tide. She realized she no longer had to drown in the memory of loss. When she finally stood, the sun was rising with quiet confidence. The Beagle fell into step beside her, tail swaying like a soft metronome. The tide kept climbing slowly, washing footprints and old pain away. Ellen placed the wood beneath the rock, returning it to its rightful place. And with that gesture, she felt a long-awaited shift settle inside her. The next morning brought clear light, calm air, and unexpected clarity. Ellen made coffee slowly, savoring the steady rhythm of the morning. The Beagle sat nearby, tail sweeping the floor in lazy contentment. A quiet smile touched her face, unforced and effortlessly natural. Something inside her had finally released in the right direction. After breakfast, she picked up the scarf she had used as a collar. The fabric felt warm now, softened by small moments shared. The Beagle tilted his head, sensing the shift forming between them. Ellen knelt before him, meeting his brown eyes without hesitation. "I think you've already chosen your home," she whispered softly. She secured the makeshift collar around his neck with care. The Beagle pressed his head into her hand, warm and trusting. Emotion rose gently in her, no longer sharp or overwhelming. There was no guilt, only quiet acceptance of this new bond. Allowing love again felt like making space for breath and light. Later, she walked to Margaret's cabin beneath the midday sun. Margaret greeted her with a smile that saw far more than words. "You look lighter," she said, offering no further explanation. Ellen nodded, understanding fully what she meant without asking. She felt the same light, open, quietly unburdened at last. They walked along the shore, watching waves crest with soft rhythm. Margaret spoke about her new series, light stretching over water. Ellen listened, absorbing each word with calm, renewed presence. She imagined helping, watching, maybe even learning to paint. Possibilities she had shut out before now whispered gently to her. When she returned to the house, it no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like the beginning of something rather than an escape. She opened the windows, letting cool air sweep through each room. The scent of sea and pine mixed easily with the warmth inside. For the first time, she was no longer hiding from her own life. That evening she sat on the porch with the Beagle curled in her lap. The sunset brushed the horizon with soft pinks and gentle oranges. Ellen breathed in deeply, letting the quiet settle through her bones. She didn't know what the future held, but she didn't fear it anymore. Acceptance felt less like an ending and more like a door opening. The last day dawned softly, with the sea breathing in slow rhythm. Ellen rose early. Before sunlight fully stretched across the horizon, the Beagle yawned behind her, stretching with gentle contentment. Her bags were packed, and the house grew still around her, but her heart felt open, steady, and strangely peaceful now. She walked to the beach one last time before leaving. Cold sand molded beneath her steps like a quiet farewell. The sea glimmered in pale blue, calm and listening. Waves moved like practiced breaths, rising and receding. The world seemed to hum with a final, gentle wisdom. Ellen stopped near the water, inhaling the morning deeply. There was no fear left, only tenderness for what had been. She thought of Mark, not with ache, but with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, letting the words drift outward. The sea answered with a small wave that touched her feet. The Beagle raced through the sand, leaving joyful tracks behind. Ellen laughed, the sound brightening the cool morning air. It was a laugh fully alive, unburdened, entirely her own. Life had begun returning, first timidly, then with warmth. Moving forward felt like honoring what she once feared losing. Turning back toward the house, she felt calm rather than torn. Cape Cod no longer felt like a place holding her pain hostage. It had become a chapter, honest and transformative in its way. Not an ending, but something that guided her back to herself. She carried its lessons quietly, like a hand resting on her back. She placed the Beagle on the car seat, watching him settle easily. The sea shimmered behind her, touched by the new morning light. She looked at it one final time, feeling no need for closure. The ocean had taken, but it had also returned something vital. She smiled softly and whispered, "I'm ready now." As she drove back toward Boston, the road opened ahead of her, not as an escape route, but as an invitation to something new. The world felt larger than her grief, and finally within reach. She didn't know exactly what awaited her beyond this journey, but she knew she had found her way back to herself at last.